almost exactly 100 years since the end of the First World War, which at that time many people around the world, particularly in the United States, took an interest in what air power could do and what air power could become. It really has influenced certainly U.S. military strategy, but military strategy all over the world in really profound ways, I think. First of all, at the end of the First World War, air power had been useful, but not really decisive in any way. And there were a number of limitations to that. But without going into the World War I limitations, let me say this is what in the United States people thought about World War, the aircraft that were available, and then what the future would be in terms of U.S. strategy. For air power, they were talking about in a strategic realm, that is bombing not just the frontline targets, but what were perceived to be in World War I, the most vulnerable places to destroy the enemy. Factories behind the lines. In other words, where the power was coming to the front, strategically, in other words. And the second one was tactically. That is to direct artillery, to strafe trenches, to do all sorts of things, working very closely, mainly with the Army, and a little bit of cases with the Navy, both in striking targets and also reconnaissance. So that's what they were in 1918, but many big changes were anticipated. Some of the limitations that could have been overlooked, or perhaps were overlooked, but were certainly evident. Weather. You couldn't fly in bad weather and have any really effective air-to-ground cooperation or do reconnaissance. So that was a big one. The second thing that was a limitation that they would see more and more was the target array. In other words, what should be aimed at. Strategic aviation, or strategic bombing, as it was called then, even then, anticipated combat against a like power that had an industrial base somewhat like the United States. So the targets for that were the industrial production, transportation, things that made the country work. So that was a limitation that they were going to see later on when we're talking about non-industrial powers. The second thing is how do the people in the aircraft know what is going on the ground, and the ability to see and recognize targets. That became a constant time throughout from World War I on. And finally, cooperation with the parent service, either the Army or naval aviation with the Navy. If you've got a weather-limited weapon, no one is going to want to absolutely depend on it. Certainly the Army that has artillery, they don't want a system, aircraft system, for instance, that can show up or not show up. And they won't be able to really readily communicate with it. Second of all, in the Navy, for instance, their striking power was the battleships. And the battleship admirals and the whole idea of what naval warfare was about using aircraft for reconnaissance, but the main striking power became the battleships. I have to say, in the 20 years after World War I, the Marines had the least problem with adapting to aviation. They were much more on their own. They often didn't have artillery. So they're the ones who, more than other services, more than the Army or the Air Force, introduced and became successful in doing close air support, that is, bombing right on the front lines. In fact, the Marines became to depend on it more than the other services. So you have limitations in targeting. You have limitations because of weather, and also the presumption that aircraft really are going to be dominant over ground or naval warfare among the airmen. That was because the heavy bombing aircraft that were developed right up until the mid-1930s were at least as fast or faster than any other small aircraft that were trying to intercept them. And second of all, you couldn't find an aircraft that could come in. It was both in speed and attack from so many directions. It was thought to be invulnerable for defenses. Move forward 20 years from the end of World War I. They've invented radar. Now there are fighters that can run down aircraft. So that is a big problem that you have that is evident in 20 years after World War I, but not fully appreciated. The people who relied on the anticipated changes in technology understood the power of the bomber and how to make that better. They really failed to understand how other technologies can also advance, like radar, like small aircraft that can intercept aircraft. So you go into World War II, and you have this issue of trying to prosecute a strategic bombing campaign. with going against better and better radars and better air defense fighters. It takes place, and there's no time here to go into it, but that is a problem that is faced, relying on one technology, not seeing other technologies. What is surprising in the Second World War is that tactical aviation becomes far more capable than either the Army or the Navy anticipated. The battleship striking power of the Navy was sunk at Pearl Harbor. So by process of elimination, aircraft carriers, which are supposed to be in a subsidiary role for reconnaissance, now become the striking power of the Navy, and that goes on till today. Certainly it is a dominant naval weapon in terms of moving across the Pacific was naval aviation. Similarly, the ability of the Army Air Forces tactically working with the Army ground forces also achieve, in terms of the Army's perspective, far more capability and are much more decisive than the ground forces ever anticipated.